Ken Delaney, who's outside the courthouse where George Papadopoulos was just sentenced to 14 days in jail and 1 year of supervised release. Any insight into what went into that sentence and whether or not that was because Papadopoulos ended up being useful or helpful to the Mueller investigators?
It wasn't because he was useful or helpful, Nicole. It was because the judge heard him express profound remorse for what he did. He said he was deeply ashamed and embarrassed, and he apologized to his family. And the judge said he took that into account when passing sentence. The judge also noticed that noted that most people charged with this crime of lying to investigators and who are in George Papadopoulos' position with no prior criminal record, most of those people are never sentenced to jail at all. But the judge found that this was a different case because this was about national security. And the judge found that George Papadopoulos put his own personal interests over the interests of the nation. Because don't forget, let's back up, George Papadopoulos was worked essentially by an agent of Russian intelligence who approached him, who saw him as low-hanging fruit, an advisor to the Trump campaign, a junior person, 29 years old. And this professor, Joseph Mifsud, told Papadopoulos that the Russians had obtained dirt in the form of thousands of emails on Hillary Clinton. Papadopoulos possessed this information, and we still don't know to this day who inside the Trump campaign he told about that information. But Papadopoulos' lawyer, Thomas Breen, said that after meeting with Mifsud, Papadopoulos made a lot of efforts to try to broker a meeting between senior Russian officials and the Trump campaign. And Papadopoulos' lawyer told the judge that Donald Trump and Jeff Sessions appeared to look favorably on the idea that that meeting should occur. And I'll tell you one other really interesting thing that Papadopoulos' lawyer said in trying to explain why his client misled the FBI in January 2017 when they went to talk to him about this. He noted that just a few days before, Donald Trump had called the Russia investigation fake news and a witch hunt. And George Papadopoulos' lawyer said the president of the United States hindered this investigation more than George Papadopoulos ever could. He said the guy he worked for was telling everybody that this investigation was fake news and a witch hunt. The idea being that those statements by Donald Trump may have influenced George Papadopoulos when confronted by the FBI about this Russia investigation to mislead the FBI, Nicole.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.